Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, there's a Chinese saying that if you meet people 3 times on a day, on the same day, you have to buy them lunch. So here we are. I'm up here the 3rd round today. Now, it is my great honor to introduce our distinguished keynote luncheon speaker for Hong Kong GCC's International Business Summit, Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles. And thank you, Sir Sherard, for spending Thanksgiving Day here with us in Hong Kong. Thank you so much. Now, Sir Sherard's remarkable career spans decades of leadership in both the public and private sectors. As a former British ambassador to Israel, Afghanistan, and Saudi Arabia, he has navigated some of the most complex geopolitical landscapes, gaining invaluable insights into international relations and business diplomacy. His extensive experience in global affairs, combined with his deep understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing businesses today, makes him an exceptional voice on the issues that matter most to us. Now, given his extensive experience in Asia, the Middle East, and China, we eagerly anticipate his perspective on how the West views the rising economic influence of these regions. Additionally, his insights on how Hong Kong can play a pivotal role in these evolving global dynamics and in China's efforts to internationalize its economy will be invaluable. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you, all the dear friends I see here in my beloved Hong Kong. Now, a friend and colleague of mine, not a million miles from 1 Queen's Road Central, when he heard I was doing this, he said, "Sherard, be as boring as you possibly can be." Because he knows that sometimes I have the tendency to speak truth to power. So over the next 40 minutes, I am going to bore you to death. Only joking. No, I'm flattered to have been asked here at this lunchtime. I first came to Hong Kong in 1985, and I'll never forget the sensation of landing at Kai Tak, flying by helicopter to Fan Ling to see the late, great Teddy Youde, a man who really fought for Hong Kong. And then, to my surprise and delight, nearly 10 years later, precisely because I'd learnt Arabic in the Foreign Office, and the then governor of Hong Kong hated what he called sinological claptrap. He didn't want anyone who knew anything about China giving him advice. I was asked to be the last head of the Hong Kong department. But I took over only in March 1994, after the real damage had been done. But 30 years ago, next January, I was called into his study in Government House and told that he wanted to break off negotiations with China on the Court of Final Appeal and unilaterally introduce a bill into LegCo. I was horrified because we knew, with good reason, that China wanted Hong Kong to succeed and prosper, that it was committed to one country, 2 systems, that it was upset at the way we had gone unilateral over democracy, or so-called democracy, and was appalled at the thought that Britain might move unilaterally to destroy the prospect of judges appointed under British sovereignty riding the through train. So I flew back to London, extremely worried, because the then governor was a big political beast. He was also a wounded political beast. And I asked two of my predecessors what on earth I should do. One of them said, "Sherard, you have to vote your conscience." And the other said, "If you value your career, just go along with whatever the governor wants." Well, I'm ashamed of many things in my personal and professional life, but on that late January day in 1995, I did the thing I am proudest of in my career as a public servant. I decided to put a submission to the Foreign Secretary saying that we had to overrule the governor and continue negotiating with China in the long-term interests of the people of this beloved territory. And I was furious when Jonathan Dimbleby's book, The Last Governor, came out, and it said that in every policy submission I put up to British ministers, I put the interests of British business first. I never, ever mentioned British business. I said we had benefited from this territory for decades. We had taken it by force. You only have to read those two wonderful books by Stephen W. Platt, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom and Imperial Twilight, to make you realize how Britain came to seize Hong Kong. I said we had benefited from it. We had done enormously well out of it, and we owed it to the people of this territory as we returned them to Chinese sovereignty to make sure that their long-term interests were protected. Anyhow, we muddled on through. We overruled the governor again shortly before the handover in saying that it was only right that if the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment, the Royal Air Force, and the Royal Navy left a small party behind, having hauled down the Union flag, we should allow a party of the People's Liberation Army to come in to haul up the flag of the People's Republic of China and the Bauhinia flag. That was not what the governor wanted, but by then, a British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, said we had to come to a reasonable compromise, and that is what we did. And I flew out of Kai Tak in the 747 we had chartered to bring out the British party for the handover, never guessing that I would ever come back to have such a close association with this great territory. And then in 2013, I had lunch with an Uber toff in London who wanted me to raise money. And he said, "Dear boy, you've been ambassador in Israel. You must know lots of rich Jews. And you've been ambassador in Saudi Arabia. You must know lots of rich Arabs. Will you join the fundraising committee of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust?" And of course I said yes. And then we ran out of conversation, and this Uber toff, whom many of you will know, but I won't name, said to me, "Dear boy," he said, "how's work going?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I'm bored." And he said, "We can't have that. You must speak this afternoon to Stuart Gulliver." And that's what I did. And I've had 11 happy, very happy years working for Wei Fung, one of the world's great banks. A bank that I first came to know when I came out here in 1985. And then a year later, the private secretary to the governor of the Bank of England rang me and said, "Can my boss come to see yours, the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office, this afternoon? It's something very secret and very urgent. And I said, of course, we can see the governor at 3 o'clock. And as he rang off, the governor to the private secretary to the governor said, oh, by the way, the governor will be driving himself. So I went down to the back door of the Foreign Office at 5 to 3, and there was the sight of another uber-British toff coming to see my boss in the Foreign Office, who'd been at a certain school west of London with him, a man described as having one pinstripe too many. And I saw the governor approaching the back door of the Foreign Office, driving his own Rolls-Royce. I think the present governor of the Bank of England drives a Skoda, or just possibly a Volvo. Anyhow, he came upstairs, and these two Etonians sat down, and I sat in the middle with my notebook. And Robin Lee Pemberton said to Sir Anthony Ackland, I am very worried about the Midland Bank, and I want the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation to raise its stake gradually in the Midland Bank. And how is the government of China going to react, and how is the government of Hong Kong going to react? So that afternoon, I drafted 2 secret, immediate telegrams, in code, of course, to the governor of Hong Kong and to the ambassador at Peking, as we used to call it. And the answer came back overnight that providing we explained what was happening, which we did, everything would be okay. And the rest is history. Now, I don't want to go on about the past, but I just want to say this. On the plane coming, I can't remember where, because I've had 2 weeks on the road, but I'm reading a wonderful book about Israel and the Arabs in Palestine. And that book quotes a Palestinian-Israeli historian, Oded Bishara, who says, we may have different narratives about the past, but we must have a shared narrative about the future. And that applies to our different views of what has or hasn't happened here, not just in relation to the mistakes Britain made in the run-up to the handover, but also in the past few years. And now we must look to the future, and that is precisely what, with Peter Burnett as our new chief executive, I, as chair of the China-Britain Business Council, have been trying to do to the relationship between the United Kingdom and China, between Yingguo and Zhongguo. And I'm pleased to report that thanks to what the Russians call life itself, the realities of life, but also to a lot of quiet, hard work behind the scenes with the incoming British government, we now have a British government that doesn't believe that life in the real world is black and white and good and evil, that it is shades of grey, that if you're going to succeed in business or in international relations, you do not apply what is called in logic the law of the excluded middle. You take the world as it is, not as you want it to be, and you make the very best of it in your own national or commercial interest. So we have had, in the past few months, an extremely successful telephone call between the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, and President Xi Jinping. We had a pitch-perfect visit to Beijing and Shanghai by the new British Foreign Secretary, including a meeting with many of our British businesses represented in our business council, but also in China. We had a very good telephone call between the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, and Vice Premier He Lifang. And then most important, a week ago on Monday, across the South Atlantic in Rio, President Xi Jinping met Sir Keir Starmer. Now, many of you will have seen the television coverage in which Sir Keir rattled through his speaking note rather too quickly. And before the Chinese minders had decided to ask the press to leave, he got too far ahead of himself and read out the points which every British minister has to make about Hong Kong and human rights and Xinjiang and Taiwan. The press weren't thrown out because he'd raised them. They were thrown out because it was time to move to the private part of that discussion. And I can tell you, and this has been evidenced as we've moved from province to province and party secretary to party secretary across the mainland, but I know this from someone who was present on the British side at that meeting, that it was extremely warm because Britain and China both want, after 5 years of madness, a grown-up, balanced relationship in which, of course, we protect our national security. Of course, we stand up for our values. But of course, we engage where it is in our economic, commercial, educational, or cultural interest to do so. And that is what we intend to do in the next few weeks and months, starting in January with a visit by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the first, I'm ashamed to say, the first economic and financial dialogue between Britain and China in 6 years. And we will do that with a large business delegation, and Wei Feng will be represented at a very senior level indeed. And we will take it from there through the spring and the summer and the autumn and beyond. We will take the long view because Britain needs China, we need growth, and China needs Britain. And our two economies complement each other and, in so many different ways, whether it's financial and professional services from Britain to China, whether it is electric vehicles, or I should call them new energy vehicles, from China to Britain. And I'm so proud. It's about the one benefit of Brexit that I can think of, is that Britain has decided not to apply tariffs to Chinese electric vehicles. I joked in China, and this is under the Chatham House rule, that my two words I hate most both begin with T, tariff, and I'll leave you to guess what the other one is. Which brings me to my beloved Hong Kong and to the orange-colored elephant in the room. It brings me to how we are going to rebuild now with the help of people like Peter and Jeremy and Paul McComb and Andrew Seaton and others, so many others, the relationship between Britain and Hong Kong. Not that that relationship on a people-to-people, university to university, college to college, profession to profession relationship isn't in good working order. But we must get back to a position where British cabinet ministers come here and policy secretaries go to London. We have so much more in common. Hong Kong is such an asset to Britain. Britain exports more to Hong Kong than we do to Japan. Hong Kong invests 3 times in the United Kingdom what mainland China invests in the United Kingdom. So we will work gradually and quietly. We made a start last a week or two ago when the new British Minister for Asia, Catherine West, came here. It was more submarine warfare than sending in a carrier battle group. She is Australian, She spent a year in Nanjing. She speaks Putonghua, and she had a very good visit. She came back impressed and realized that the calumny, the nonsense that Hong Kong has become just another Chinese city is not only untrue, it needs to be rolled back and put back where it belongs, which is, I don't say where, but it is just so manifestly wrong, and it is so manifestly not what China wants, it's not what Britain wants, and it's not what the world wants or needs. Because as the world changes, as the patterns of trade change, as tariffs rise and fall, as RCEP, which accounts for 30% of the world's population and 30% of the world's GDP, really gets going, Hong Kong's role as a vital connector, as a vital nodal point between China and the world, a changing world, will remain more important than ever. Now, you don't need me, a Guilo from London, pontificating about that, because you live and breathe it every day. But we can help by reminding people quietly, not in public debate, but by setting out the facts, that Hong Kong has many friends, not just in London or Edinburgh or Manchester or Cardiff, but around the world. People who've been here, who've profited from it, who've enjoyed it, and those people need to make the case for Hong Kong, not by taking on the politicians face to face. Most of them are just extraordinary in how hypocritical they can be. I remember a couple of years ago going to see Uber Hawke in the US Congress, in the House of Representatives, who was lambasting me about China and Hong Kong and how they were the same and how awful they were. And then as I left his office on Capitol Hill, he turned to me like the American detective Columbo, said, "Just one more thing. Can you, Wei Feng, HSBC, help me export more bourbon from my district in Kentucky to China?" He would sanction left and right, he would make fire-breathing speeches, but he still wanted bourbon from Kentucky to come to China. So over the next few weeks and months, we will be quietly working, Peter with a revived Hong Kong Association, on whose board I'm proud to sit in London, with the China-Britain Business Council, to get this relationship back where it ought to have been. And so please help us in this, not by publicly debating with the swivel-eyed loons who brought us Brexit and now try to smash up the relationship between Britain and China, but by traveling, engaging, inviting your friends and colleagues, your boards, to come out here and see for themselves. And in all this, I just want to look back to two periods in our shared history. First, in 1941, a distant cousin of mine called John Harris fought on the Peak to defend this territory against invaders from the north. And he wrote a book about it, which some of you may have read. But far more moving, and it brought tears to my eyes, was a week ago on Saturday, I went out to the Chinese University and saw an extraordinary exhibition of a diary written by a young Chinese naval officer about the time he spent with the Royal Navy on HMS Ramillies, one of the great battleships, bombarding the German positions on the 6th of June and the days that followed in 1944, about how he and 24 other officers from the Chinese Navy fought with the Royal Navy, and then in September, I think it was, 1945, sailed into Victoria Harbour with Rear Admiral Harcourt to return this territory to British sovereignty. On that vessel, HMS Ramillies, was a Soviet officer, Commander Sokolov, and when those officers returned to China, half of them came to Hong Kong or Taiwan, but half of them went back north, and some of them became officers in the Navy, or what was soon to be the Navy of the People's Republic of China. So it was only fitting that when he came to London in 2015, President Xi Jinping spoke in his speech of these 24 Chinese heroes who had fought with British forces in the run-up to the return of Europe from the dark days of Nazi domination. So, thank you for listening to me. I'm so proud to be back here. I don't know that much about China or Hong Kong, but I do know what I love, and I do know what matters for both our countries, which is having a proper, load-bearing, full bandwidth, economic, commercial, cultural, educational relationship between this territory and London, and between our two peoples who are so closely intertwined. Thank you very much, Agnes.
Thank you, Sir Sherard. Please kindly be seated on stage. May I now invite the Chamber's former chairman and council member, Dr. Y.K. Pang, to join Sir Sherard on stage to moderate the fireside session.
Well, thank you very much, Sherard. I know that I stand between everyone and the lunch, so we'll try to keep it brief because I think Sherard has actually addressed many of the points that we were literally dying to hear. You know, you make a very, very important point about a renewal of the relationship between Britain and Hong Kong and China. Actually, Theresa May was probably the last prime minister who actually met, you know, the top leaders of China. Since then, 3 prime ministers who have come and gone have not actually engaged at all with one of the great economic and trading and historic partners of China. And that's, in fact, a rather unfortunate development. I think hopefully with the new government in Britain, there will be a renewal. But can you tell us why is it that they have to keep on, you know, talking about Xinjiang actually and talking about, you know, our human rights and so on? Because, you know, obviously it's not productive. And you know that it always, you know, causes a reaction in China.
Well, YK, I'm very flattered to have you from what I think is called the princely Hong, moderating this and interviewing me. No, I mean, this is politics. It's a reflection of the realities in the House of Commons and beyond. It's also a reflection of the way in which politics cross the Atlantic and back and forth, and why Britain needs to pursue its own course in this. And we mustn't have a sort of preemptive kowtow to what we imagine will be American policy, because America is very good at pursuing its own national economic interests while at the same time taking the moral high ground. Britain is less good, I think, at being quite running on parallel tracks.
Mm-hmm. And Sherard, you've just been on an extensive trip visiting China. So can you tell us a little bit about your experiences on this particular visit? What did you observe, and how do you see, you know, the mainland developing, and how the relationships between, you know, the mainland and also, you know, Europe and Britain going forward?
Well, the first thing to say is that the message has gone right through the Chinese system that China and Britain now need to get back to a sensible working relationship. There isn't perhaps the naivety there might have been in the golden era. They recognize that there will be differences. The Chinese do not mind us disagreeing, providing we do so courteously and respectfully. So that's one thing. And I think we will see that taken forward in the months and years ahead. In all of this, helped by a wonderful Chinese ambassador in London, who is Cantonese, who has family here in Hong Kong, and who, like most people, in fact, like everyone we met, wants Hong Kong to be different, wants one country, two systems to endure, and wants Hong Kong, in China's interests as well as the world's interest, to continue to be distinctive. So we saw that, and we saw a great interest in and affection for a Hong Kong that is confident in itself, that is proud of itself and its tradition, but also its part as part of Greater China.
Right, thank you. Now, the House of Representatives in the U.S. recently asked Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to rethink ties of Hong Kong's banking sector, claiming that we are now supporting the axis of evil without any truth or evidence in any of this. And then this morning I saw that actually the European Parliament is putting forward a similar request to the European Commission to do something similar. So all of this vilification, unfair sort of bias against Hong Kong and China is very real. Given the improvement in ties between Britain and mainland China, do you think that there's a role for Britain and for us here in Hong Kong working again closely with a long-time business partner and political partner, Britain, for a coming together where Britain could play a middleman sort of role and help bridge the gap between the US and Europe with Hong Kong and China?
Yes, I hope so, but we mustn't overestimate it. And as I said in my talk, I think publicly joining battle with the China hawks is what they most want, because their position isn't necessarily rational. I mean, I've debated them in the past in the UK, and you can set out all the facts, but their position is based on often on ideology and ignorance. But we do need to work together. But I think in the end, America will pursue its own economic interests. The markets will have their say. And in the end, America has to recognize that Hong Kong will continue to play an absolutely vital role as an economic connector between China and the world, and between China and America.
Changing geographies slightly, you have deep experience as ambassador in the Middle East. There's now a ceasefire in Lebanon, and Hezbollah is going to have a ceasefire with Israel. How do you see things playing out in the next few months? Will Donald Trump actually create peace in the Middle East on the first day he takes office?
No, he won't, nor will he do what he promised, which was to spring somebody out of prison in a day. He might make a difference. He might make a difference on Ukraine, and I wish him luck with that. I mean, the sad truth with Israel-Palestine, I was the first British ambassador to Israel to speak Arabic, but also Hebrew, and then I went from there to Saudi Arabia. There are only 4 options. One is a single state with Jews and Arabs living together. That's not going to work. Another is what is called, rather chillingly in Hebrew, transfer, which is the Hebrew for ethnic cleansing. That is not acceptable and won't be accepted by Egypt or Jordan. Or there is the present rather messy standoff, which isn't worthy of either side. Or there is the solution which Lord Peel, when he went out after the disturbances in Palestine in 1937, to which what he called then partition and is now called a 2-state solution. In practice, it will initially at least be a 1.5 state solution. Interestingly, there is a connection between Hong Kong and historic Palestine because the chief secretary of Palestine at that time was a man called Mark Young. He then came on here to be governor. He was interned by the Japanese and he suffered terribly and then came back in 46 and started on the road towards developing democracy. When I was learning Hebrew, out of the blue, I got a letter from his son. My father had died in 1968 when I was 13, and so there was a lot about my father I didn't know. He'd had a heart attack. And this letter from Mark Young's son said rather movingly, "My dear Cowper-Coles, I'm delighted to read in this morning's Times that you're going to be our next ambassador to Israel. You may not know that in the winter of 1938, your father and I went down to Dovercourt, which was a holiday camp near Harwich, to receive the Kindertransport, the German Jewish children who were fleeing from Germany, and that your father, who was studying German at school, manned the telephone exchange to help these poor children telephone back to their families in Germany." So that moved me to tears, but there is this connection with Hong Kong.
Well, thank you very much, Sherard. And you've been very, very generous and candid with your remarks. What you said earlier would probably make an excellent script for a Netflix series, but we will save that for another day. Ladies and gentlemen, please give us a very big hand to Sir Sherard Cowper-Coles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Sherard and Dr. Pang. Please kindly remain on stage. May I now invite Chamber Chairman Ms. Agnes Chan and Vice Chairman PCU and Douglas Wu on stage to present a memento to our keynote speaker and to take a group photo. Thank you all. Could the chamber leaders please escort Sir Sherard back to his seat?
No, thank you, Agnes, and thank you for making me so welcome. I just wanted, because you've given me such a lovely present, to give you a present to cheer you up. And that is a true story, which I think at least 3 of you have heard before, but it happened up the hill here in Government House in 1996. Now, I know many of you will be going out to the airport this afternoon to celebrate the opening of the 3rd runway. Well, I think it was 1996, Mrs. Thatcher, for whom I used to be a speechwriter, came out here to open the Ching Ma Bridge. And as many of you will know, she and Chris Patten didn't get on particularly well. They came from different wings of the Conservative Party, although she was much more sensible on China and Hong Kong than he was. Anyhow, he gave a dinner for her at Government House, and everyone was rather in awe of her. And after dinner, nobody wanted to sit next to Mrs. Thatcher on the sofa. And so Chris Patten, I was the junior diplomat there, he said, Sherard, you go and sit next to Mrs. Thatcher. And I didn't know what on earth to say to her. And I'd had a glass of wine. And I remembered that when I worked for the permanent secretary in the Foreign Office, I used to read the records of her discussions with President Mitterrand of France, who was a great seducer of women, or charmer. And these records covered discussion of what was then called the Channel Fixed Link, and is now called the Channel Tunnel. And Mrs. Thatcher kept saying, "Francois, I am passionate about the fixed link. I am passionate," and she kept using this word passionate. So, fired by a glass of wine, I said to her, "Mrs. Thatcher, when I read those records of your conversations with President Mitterrand, I thought there was an erotic dimension to them." And I woke up at 3 o'clock in Government House thinking, my God, what did I say last night? And then I remembered that far from being offended, Mrs. Thatcher, who always liked a good-looking man who charmed her, she puffed herself up and she said in immortal words, "Mr. Cowper-Coles, do you know, I think President Mitterrand was rather attracted to me."
Thank you, Sir Sherard, once again. And please could chamber leaders now escort Sir Sherard back to his seat.